Good morning. I'm going to be talking about a router table today. Anybody who has a router probably already knows the benefits of having a table. But if you don't have a table and you're wondering what you would do with it, I've had a router for probably longer than most of you have been alive, and I think I've used it by the hand in the handheld mode two, maybe three times. I can't even think what you would use it for. One time I used the handheld mode for a laminate top. I had to trim the edges off. The other time I used it for doing some mortises. And to be perfectly honest, I should have just gone out and bought a mortising machine to do it. Router is good for cutting grooves. It's good for putting fancy edges on wood. It's good for making raised panels. But when you're starting to do a lot of dado work, you're better off with a table saw. If you're going to be doing a lot of mortising work, you're better off with a standard mortising machine. So a router is used mainly for making moldings and stuff like that. So today I'm going to go over what my table is. To start with, the top is made out of a work surface for modular furniture. It's 2 feet wide and it's 4 feet long, and it's nice and solid, probably about an inch thick. The bench it sits on, made out of just whatever I had laying around here, and the bench probably cost me about $15 to make. There's a lot of router tables you can buy, but this is one of the things that I would recommend that people make. There's a lot of people who want to make everything for their router, from feather boards to router lifts out of scissor jacks and things like that, which make absolutely no sense. But to buy a router table, that really makes no sense. You're going to pay $100, $200, $300. I've seen them as high as $500 for a router table. And if you're spending that kind of money, more power to you. But anyhow, so let me go over the parts of this table. The first part, let's talk about it. It's 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, and it's 38 inches high. Now, I like it 38 inches high because that's a comfortable height to work on. The bandsaw is about 40 inches high. Table saw is about 36 inches high. You don't want it real low because you're going to be bending over, and you don't want to do that. The base itself, just some wood that I got out of the bargain bin at Home Depot, and I guess it's probably about 26 inches wide, and as you can see, it doesn't go to both ends of the table. It doesn't really have to be anything fancy. You can even put it on some pipe legs if space is a concern, which is another point. If space is a concern, some people have opted to go on to the extension of their table saws, and I would definitely not recommend that. It's just a hassle. Every time you want to saw, you have to lower the router bit. The router is subjected to more dust. It just doesn't make sense. Plus, the table saw, they say that they're using the table saw because they can use the fence, and the fence is something else we'll talk about in a minute. But anyhow, make a dedicated router table. If you don't have room, put it on pipes with pipe flanges, and when you're done with it, unscrew the pipes, and you'll have a piece of wood that's an inch or inch and a half thick wide. I'm sure you have some place in your shop that you can set that up against the wall or whatever. The other thing with the router table, if you build it with drawers in it, you've got space to put out your stuff, and you don't have that with just the table saw. So anyhow, I would recommend building my own. I think this whole thing here, I can't really give you a price on it. I'm guessing it was under $75 for everything that I have on here. It was probably under $60. But anyhow, getting back to the router, let's start with how I switch it. To turn the router on, I have a regular switch. You should probably have a 20 amp switch. This is a 15, but it works fine. The router runs off of 15 amps anyhow. On the inside, I have a receptacle which I have both the router and the shop vac plugged into. Now I've thrown some dust up here so you can see. I have the fitting for the shop vac, again from Rockler, $2 or $3. That goes down, gets hooked up into the shop vac. So when I turn the router on, everything goes on at once. Clears it off fine. You don't have to have a regular dust collection system built into your shop. The router vacuum works fine, or the shop vacuum works fine. However, you do have to have the dust extraction. The next thing is featherboards. Featherboards are extremely important. If you don't have featherboards, you're going to have problems with the wood wanting to waver or wanting to wander. So I have my featherboards set up so that I have them holding the wood down and holding against the edge of the fence. Now if you don't have that, let me show you. Here's a piece of molding, and this didn't have a featherboard on. I don't know if I can zoom in on it or not, but you can see what happens at the end of it. All right, it just completely ruined the molding. So you really have to have a featherboard if you're doing longer pieces of wood. Without it, the wood has a tendency to wander over the bit. Another thing that's important is a lift, some way to get the router up and down. Some people will say, well, I don't need a lift because I just take my plate out of the table and I change my bits that way. Well, that's not the purpose of a lift. The purpose of a lift is to get your bit to the exact height you need to have it. Now with this one, I use the router razor. It goes in and it just turns, you turn the handle and it raises or lowers the router. Some people have tried to make these things out of scissor jacks for cars. Don't ask me how they expect that to work. It's just too crude. When you're adjusting, you need to adjust it by thousandths of an inch, not by a half an inch at a time. And with a scissors jack, every time you turn that handle once, you're lifting the car off the ground about a half an inch or so. So that's one of the things that you don't want to try making yourself. So anyhow, you're going to need to get things accurate, you are going to need to have some way to lift the router up and down. The other thing is a miter slot. Now, again, there'll be people who will argue against a miter slot. They'll say, oh, you don't need it. You can use a sled or something, something like that. Well, a sled really isn't that good when you want to try to do things. This is a sled. And the purpose of the sled is to hold the wood against your fence. And then the idea is that you just move the sled down. The problem is that, as you can see, the sled has thickness to it. All right? So if you're doing something like this, where you're making a raised panel door or a door of any kind, you're going to have to go into the end of the wood, like that. All right? Now, if you put this on the sled, what happens is the sled's raising this piece of wood up another quarter of an inch or so. So when you get into the setup, it's much more difficult to try to have to use a sled. You take it and you put it down and you clamp it in and so on and so forth. But in reality, the sled is not a really good way to do this type of a joint. I like the simple miter gauge. Gauge, you can put it in, put your miter Put your wood on top of it. Let's get that. Okay. Okay, with a miter gauge, again, you put your wood in and just run it straight down to where your bit's going to be. All right, so you don't have to take any special measurements into consideration like you do if you're using a sled. Another thing you're going to want is a router plate, and it's not absolutely necessary. You could actually attach your router to the bottom of a piece of wood and have it work. The benefit of the router plate, though, is that you have spaces or circles that you take out, which allows you to put larger router bits in. For example, a small router bit would work in there. However, if you have a large router bit, that obviously isn't going to work. So you have to be able to take the center rings out in order to be able to use the larger bits. So get yourself a good router plate to mount your router onto. And the next thing would be your feather boards. You need feather boards to hold it tight against the fence and tight down against the table. Again, if you don't have that, the wood's going to chatter and you're going to ruin your whatever it is you're trying to make. Now this fence is very simple. You see them for sale for sometimes hundreds of dollars for a fence, and they'll say, well, you know, you can move this fence back 10 inches or 20 inches or whatever. Don't ask me why you would want to do that, because all your cuts, well, 99.9% of your cuts are done right here, right at the very edge of your fence. That's where your router bit's going to sit. And if your fence goes back all the way back to the wall, well, what are you going to do with it? It's, you know, you can't route anything this far away from it unless you're trying to put a groove in a piece of wood. And if you're putting a groove in a piece of wood, I suppose you could, you know, you'd want to have it back, but then you could just take a board and clamp it to the top of the router table if you needed to do that. So as far as those fences, such as the Incra fence, it really isn't necessary. You're not going to be making those adjustments, those thousandths of an inch adjustments. You're going to be working right here most of the time, and that's where your bit's going to be sitting, and that's all you need to do. Now, another thing about router bits is that most of them will have a bearing on them, and that's actually where your wood's going to be riding against. You don't even need a fence, because your wood is riding right against this, and that's serving as a fence itself. So don't spend a lot of money on a fence. It's just a waste of money. Make your own. The fence that I made, very simple fence, about 5.5 inches high, right, with a T-track down the middle, and the T-track is to hold the feather board. On the back, it's nothing more than what you see. Another 5-inch piece of wood on the bottom, and maybe it's 6 inches, whatever. Anyhow, just a 90-degree angle. So all I have is a 90-degree angle, and there, that's a little better shot. All right. And then on the outside, I have this part of the fence, which separates. Now, the reason it separates is because you're going to be using different size bits. All right, so I can move it out or I can move it in. Obviously, if I'm using this bit, I want to move it out. If I'm using this bit, I want to move it in, just so that the wood is as close to the bit as you can get it. Now the other thing is the stationary part of the fence. I've cut a big groove out of it, right? And that's so that I have room on both sides and for the height of a bit when it comes up and down. And also, it holds the whole thing together with a solid piece of wood. If you just had two separate pieces of wood, I don't know how you would hold them together. So the solid piece of wood holds everything together, and the rest of it rides like that. Now, it's adjusted like this. Right, both sides have it. So you move back and forth. And when it comes in and out, simple wing nuts. Again, you just move it to wherever you want it and tighten it down. Now there is one other thing on this fence. Because the feather boards can only go so high, all right? They can only raise up so high, and that is going to cause you a problem if you want to put a wide piece of wood in there. Obviously, you know, your wood isn't going to fit. So what I've done, and I don't know if I can show you this or not, what I've done in the back is cut two slots, a high and a low. And on the outside, I've set another set of holes. So if I want to have this featherboard be able to go up higher, I remove this from the back, unscrew it, take it off. Let me show you. Show you what I mean. Picture's worth 1,000 words, I guess. All right, I take it, I flip it over. All right, flip it over, and now, if you notice, my T-track is much higher. Of course, you have to take the feather board off to put the feathers back down where you want them. But that gives me now, you can see the difference between how high I can raise that feather board now. So, again, what I did for that was to put two grooves in there, a high and a low. And I just put the bolt where I want it. Do I want it high or do I want it low? And once I have it set where I want it, then I can adjust my feather board to wherever I have to have it. So anyhow, I guess that's it for the router table. I would say build it, don't buy it. You get a much better product when you build it yourself than what you're going to buy in the store. And if you're into woodworking, then it just makes perfect sense to build your own. So, hope this helps.